Welcome one to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition is Disney's Aladdin, brought to us by Virgin Interactive. Disney's Aladdin for the NES was released originally only in Europe and is a NES version of the Sega Genesis classic of Aladdin. Unfortunately, as far as porting games over to systems go, this is one of the worst examples ever, turning the absolute masterpiece of Aladdin on the Sega Genesis into one of the worst looking and playing games the NES ever had to offer. It was understandable due to limitations that some things had to be changed and modified and maybe removed, but I'm sure they could have done a much better job with this game than they ended up doing. But without further ado, here we go with Aladdin on the NES. As we jump into the first level of the game, the Agrabah Market, you can immediately see just this game doesn't quite live up to what you would expect. At least the overall graphics for the characters do at least look like they're supposed to and represent like exactly the way the Sega Genesis ones looked like. However, you'll immediately notice the extremely slow gameplay. Of course, you're playing as Aladdin, and you have apples and a sword at your disposal, and you can press the select button to switch between the two, though a lot of times I find myself just jumping away from enemies and trying to run past them quickly. Jumping and falling is also extremely floaty, and also when you're falling, you kind of lose control of Aladdin. It has kind of a weird mechanic where you can kind of have control for a little bit, but after falling for a few inches, you end up losing complete control of him as he descends. In this first stage, we're going to work our way to the right, climbing up the rope at the end, before now heading over to the left side. Hit detection is another thing that you really have to battle in this game. Learning how a lot of the enemies work, a lot of them can actually be skipped altogether, but you have to jump and move accordingly. Basically, enemies have much bigger hitboxes to hit you than you would expect them to. A lot of times you're jumping over them and they swing in front of them and somehow still end up colliding with you for damage. And while this game is as bad as it is, some of the music's actually not bad. The only issue with it being a lot of the tracks from the Genesis version don't end up making it over. In fact, there's only a couple level songs altogether instead of some of the cool original pieces. We make it to the end of the first level. We then get to do the mini game where basically you have a slot machine, and as many of the tokens as you were able to pick up, you're able to kind of get some bonus extra items. It seems much more weird than it does on the Genesis, and I never really had too much luck when it comes to the slot machine game. Level number 2 is the desert, where we need to collect pieces of the scarab. Start off by heading to the right here, and we're going to use the apples from a distance to take out some of the enemies. The sword is more powerful overall, but while I have the apples, I might as well use some of them here and there. Only really kind of the later levels do I really even bother switching over to the sword. Well, unfortunately, it's not included here. The song that normally plays during this particular stage is one of my favorites from the Sega Genesis version of the title. After avoiding a couple more enemies and snakes, we make it over to these trees where we'll have to jump on top of them in order to make our way through. You quickly fall through the trees, so you have to move pretty fast. After dropping down, there's a whole bunch of enemies waiting for us, but the best thing for me is just to kind of jump up quickly up the next set of trees and get through the place. Here you'll have a couple of Iagos, yes, multiple Iagos kind of waiting for you. You can take them out while you're moving along the ropes if you want to, or just kind of get past them. Over here to the left, pick up the first piece of the scarab. You need to do this in order to then go to the right and actually be able to finish up the stage. Hit the magic lamp to wipe out the enemies that are nearby. Unfortunately, it doesn't wipe out every enemy on the screen, just the ones that are like right nearby, I guess, because that one enemy ended up remaining. Either way, jump over here to the right as we have the last little bit of the stage before we finish it up and move on to the next level. Next up, we have the rooftops with our first boss encounters, as well as the goal being to collect the flutes in order to kind of get ropes to appear to allow us to go up. The ropes, no surprise, are pretty slow as far as them coming out and actually being able to ride them up. And you can do so by grabbing the first flute here, then take the rope up to the next platform, drop back down, take the next one up, watching out for this palace guard guy here, before dropping back down and grabbing another rope and riding that one all the way up to the top. Once up here, head left, jump between the ropes, and be sure to grab the flute located here, and continue on. This one will actually get this rope down here to appear, which you'll need to grab just to hit this rope. It's kind of weird that you couldn't just jump to that rope, but that's just kind of the way the hit detection and jumping and all ends up working here. Make a big leap over to the left, and you can easily grab this rope and make your way to the top, taking out one of these knife-throwing guys with some apples before heading to the right. Be sure to hit the level checkmark point if you don't want to have to redo the whole level if you die here. From there, watch out for another Iago and walk over to the right for the first boss encounter here of the game. Now, normally this guy kind of like rolls all around, throws knives at you and such, but you can kind of glitch him by just standing here and throwing apples at him non-stop. Every time you hit him, he slows down. What you'll need to do is run over, grab the scarab from him, and it feels like you can't go anywhere else, but what you have to do is walk off screen, come back, and then all of a sudden the flute appears that you can grab the next rope and get up here, which will take you right into the next boss fight. Here you'll have to battle another one of the palace guards, and you have barrels coming down at you as well as him throwing knives. A little bit of a challenge to kind of get the timing right, but if you do so, you'll be able to kind of jump up into the air, deliver hits with the apples, and be able to avoid both barrels and the knives. But you kind of have to time it just right, waiting for the knives to kind of go past you. With the hit detection being so goofy, a lot of times it looks like a knife may hit you, but it ends up just going past you. Once he's taken care of, though, we move on to the next stage. Next up is the Sultans dungeon, a level that I always thought looked really cool in the Genesis version, mostly because of like the blue background and just the whole dungeon setting as a whole. There was also like the fun little things in the game, including the skeletons that would replace their heads with bombs, as well as you saw some cameos from other Disney characters in like the background, Sebastian hanging from the wall, and there was also Mickey Mouse ears located on skeletons in the background. The skeleton enemies in this version, because they still do the same animation of replacing like the bomb on their head with their actual skull and all that, they end up doing so slowly, as everything's slow in this game, but because of that, you usually can actually completely run past them if you time it right. Sometimes they're still able to clip me as I go past and then they explode, but a lot of times you can just kind of like completely bypass them altogether. The layout of the whole map here is a little bit of a strange one, just trying to kind of figure out what platforms you can and can't go to, but even with that, it's still a relatively linear path, even with all the different platforms and ways that you're going to be falling down and going through little walkways and such. Over here, sometimes you're going to have to use like blocks that come out of the wall in order to kind of bring your way up. You have to wait for them to come out and then time your jumps accordingly to get over or up to where you need to, or to the next blocks like we have to here. Watching out for the enemy attacks and then using the block in order to kind of get my way up and then to the next big chain, climbing up my way a few sets of chains, watching out for some bats as I do so. Though, sometimes with the bats off screen, it can be really difficult to actually miss them. But, once I reach the top here, there's the exit and we move on to the next level. Next up is the Cave of Wonders, and you actually have to destroy 2 statues to beat the level, the first one being located right here. If you do not destroy the statue, which I think you have to destroy it using the sword and not the apples, but you have to destroy both of the statues in order to kind of get through a corridor at the end of the level. It's kind of weird, if you don't actually destroy the statues and make it to that corridor enemy, there's an invincible enemy that you cannot pass, who's just kind of standing there in your way. Instead of having like a wall set up or something else, there's just an invincible enemy you can't defeat. Try to do your best to avoid the boulders coming down, but that can be easier said than done, and then make a couple of leaps over to the far right. Drop on down, and you'll notice the statue in the upper left corner behind this wall. So go over here, you can grab some health if you need it, then climb up here and jump over to where the next statue is. Once you destroy that statue, head back down and head to the right here. This is the location where the enemy that we wouldn't be able to defeat is normally. As you can see when we get close, he just disappears because we were able to destroy the statues. But if you didn't get the statues, he's blocking your path and you can't go past him. Once you're here though, jump on the magic carpet and ride that down to the bottom section where you'll have to do some carefully timed jumps over to a few rocks that are in the water. There's also some jumping fish and the like, but once you make it up the next little hill, find the magic lamp and hit it, and you move on to the next level. Now it's time for the Cave of Wonders Escape. One of the harder levels overall, at least for when I was a kid on the Genesis version, though this version ends up being a bit easier. You still have giant boulders that will chase you, so you have to make sure you're running very fast through the little corridors here to outrun the giant boulders and make sure that you're able to leap to the next safe platform once you make it to the end of the tunnels. Of course, falling into the lava down below will also devastate and end up taking out a life, so you don't want to land down, of course, in that. Next up, we have another one of the giant boulders that's going to chase us. A little bit of a longer area, but as long as you're holding right on the D-pad, you should have no problem getting through, making the jump, and then right into another segment with a giant boulder, and eventually it will, too, drop down into a pit, allowing us to continue on safely. While I find this level to be actually pretty difficult in the Genesis version, with this version being easier mostly because you don't have a kind of instant fall when you end up getting hit. In the Genesis version of Aladdin, if you make a jump and get hit midway through the jump, what a lot of times ends up happening is you kind of like have a shortened jump, and because of this, a couple of jumps in particular in this area end up being more difficult than they need to in order to actually complete. So that's one benefit that this version actually has over others. At the very end of the level, we outrun one more boulder and jump to the magic carpet to finish up the stage and move on to the second part of the escape. The rug ride is another one of those really difficult levels on the Genesis, but this version actually makes it pretty easy. I still prefer the much more hectic version on the Genesis, but hey, at least this one's easier to complete. Basically, all you have to do is avoid all the giant rocks while you are sitting on the magic carpet. Now, in the Genesis version, you have hands kind of pop up that tell you where the rocks are going to spawn, either up, down, or you have both kind of going at once, and sometimes question marks. But it's the same pattern every time, so eventually, after enough trial and error, you can figure out where the rocks are going to be coming from and where to go. In this version, almost all the rocks are above us. In fact, once we kind of like dodge the very beginning, we can just kind of sit here at the very bottom of the screen and just let all the rocks kind of like bypass us. They come at you pretty slow, so even if one was coming from the bottom, it's usually pretty easy to dodge. But as you can see, the lowest rock there still just goes over my head in the end. We now have only 2 levels left in the game, first up being Sultan's Palace. Here we have to start off with a couple of difficult-esque jumps, I guess, trying to move to the rocks and making our way past a few enemies along the way without falling down into the water below. After dealing with a few enemies and quite a bit of platforming, we eventually make it to the magic carpet who's kind of waiting for us at the end. Always wondered why over there, you couldn't just come and pick me up right from the beginning, we can just kind of fly through this area. But either way, it'll take you up to this platform here. Jump off the little mini platform and up to the chains. Up here to the right is where we need to go, but you can't jump over the little wall here. Instead, we have to go all the way to the left, jump on the magic carpet, which will then kind of fly around for a while, collecting some items and the like, but eventually it will make its way back over to the right and above high enough so that we'll be able to jump over that one wall. Now, something cool you can actually do in this version is if you make a big jump off the rug at the very end, you can actually jump over the other wall as well, landing on this and going right to the end of the stage. So you don't really save a whole lot as far as like the amount of level goes, but that's a nice little trick you can end up doing to skip some of the area. Drop down here, watching out for one last enemy, take it out, and then go through the door to finish up the stage. Normally, when you're playing the Genesis version, you would have a battle here against Iago, but that has been removed from this version. It's now time for the final level of the game, Jafar's Palace, which can be difficult. Not only do you have the same guards and all we've been dealing with, but also there's sometimes fire and there's plenty of spikes lining areas for us to have to deal with as well. Interestingly enough though, Jafar doesn't have his final form in this version. He only has one form for us to fight. And similar to that boss we fought earlier in the game, it's a very easy fight as you're able to hit him with apples from a distance instead of having to really get even close and deal with him for the most part. Be careful dropping down each of these platforms as there's enemies waiting for you each time you fall, as well as spikes, so it's really kind of difficult to do, but if you time it just right, you can kind of like fall on the platform safely, hit the enemy, and avoid the spikes, but you kind of have to like really maneuver your way around. On the bottom floor here, you'll have a bunch of platforms in a row that you'll have to jump between. Nothing too spectacularly difficult, but of course we're going to want to avoid falling down into those spikes below. At the end, you'll have one of the checkpoint markers as well as one of the carpets to hit, and it'll take you up to the next platforms. You can jump off if you want to in order to hit the shop, but at this point in the game, you're probably pretty good on health or lives and just kind of want to finish things up. At the very top, run over to the right and watching out for some more spikes and a couple of enemies, and eventually you'll be able to fall down to the next area. You can either fall down or climb down the rope, but if you do fall down, of course, you may accidentally get hit by the guy throwing the little knives at the bottom. You can avoid the other guy and just head over to the left here. You have a couple more enemies before it's time for the actual boss encounter against Jafar. After getting past the last enemy, we jump on the magic carpet, and then jump over to the left past this wall, and here's where Jafar is located. If we stand right here and just throw our apples at him, he'll once in a while throw something at us and try to hit us, but it only takes a few apples, and he may get one, maybe two attacks off at you at most, before he's done and you can enjoy the ending to Aladdin on NES. And there you go, that is Aladdin on the NES. It's pretty bad, especially being so late. It was one of the last games released for the NES anywhere in the world, and you figure that that means it would have had better quality because they would have known how the system worked, but wow, did they mess up this version in particular. But anyway guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through.